Welcome to our first question and answer session. Thanks for the excellent questions. So picked out a few of them, which I'm going to respond to uh, here. So first couple of questions dealt with the issue of slavery. Founders desired to abolish slavery at the founding. Could it have been feasible? And a question about the framers thinking that basically they thought that slavery would have withered away. And the answer to both of these questions is probably yes. So, let's try to put ourselves in the position of the framers in Philadelphia in 1787. They have this seemingly intractable problem where the northern states, especially New England, have abolished slavery, large part due to the rhetoric of the Revolution. The four southern states, Virginia, North South Carolina, and Georgia, are committed to slavery, and then the Atlantic states, still have slavery, but it's not vital in their economies. But it appeared, that if you put yourself in the position, try to, they wanted to be optimistic. They could say, well, look, it's been abolished in New England. It's sort of on the way out. It was not an entirely unreasonable guess, and from their perspective, you know this applies, I think, to anything. You always want to assume that things are going to turn out the best, because that way you don't have to make the hard choices. To the extent, though, this was possible in 1787, it very quickly came undone for two separate reasons. The first, we all know, the invention of the cotton gin, which made the slave economy a far more profitable economy, because now cotton becomes king cotton in the South. And the second is the Haitian Revolution, which begins 2 years after the invention of the cotton gin of 1791. Haitian Revolution is 1793. And I mean, we think of Haiti today as this, relatively poor, quite weak country in the Caribbean. In the 19th century, especially in the first half of the 19th century, Haiti was a vital actor, very interesting country in inter-American affairs, a strong supporter of this Hispanic American revolutions, and they have a critical cultural effect on the South. For Southern slaveholders, they see what's happening in Haiti, which is a social revolution tinged with a crusade for racial equality, and this is their worst nightmare. They fear that there'll be a slave uprising in the South, that the ex-slaves will take retribution on them. So by 1795, there's no way that slavery is going to wither away. The question now is, is it going to prevail entirely, and is the country going to become a slave country, or is there going to be some massive outside intervention that will force it to be abolished? But in 1787, although we know how the story ends, and we know that this was not a correct guess, it was not a crazy hope either by the framers. Second question on the Cherokees having to flee, can they ever get their land back, given that it's stolen land? The answer is no, in large part because the Cherokees, after the Supreme Court decision, then make another deal with the, under heavy duress, with the federal government, that leads to the Trail of Tears, in which they exchange, again, this really isn't a voluntary deal, but it is what it is. They exchange their land in Georgia for a promise of land in Oklahoma. The Creek Indian Nation does the same. And so the title then shifts to this Oklahoma land rather than the land in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Can they ever get it back? No, but we're still dealing with the legal ramifications of this decision from the Supreme Court from this term, called McGirt versus Oklahoma, which was decided the same day as the Trump tax returns case. So it got almost no attention in the national press. Dealt with the issue of whether or not the Indian nations, in this case the Creek Indian Nation, retained legal rights under the provisions of these Trail of Tear era treaties. And the Supreme Court, by a vote of 5-4, with the 4 liberal justices plus Gorsuch, said yes, they do. It doesn't mean that the eastern half of Oklahoma is now suddenly a sovereign entity where, they could have an ambassador to the United States or something like that. But it does mean that in some limited areas, the issue here was whether Oklahoma state criminal law applied to the former Indian territory of Oklahoma. And the Supreme Court says no. They say that Indian criminal law applies, federal criminal law applies, but the state of Oklahoma is sort of pushed out. So this decision, which came down 8 days ago from when I'm recording this, is a reminder that we're still living with the legacy of this era, not just in the issue of race relations, but more broadly. Third question deals with presidential defiance. Why is it so accepted that Jackson ignored the Supreme Court's ruling in the Cherokee case, and then Lincoln's message on the president defying Supreme Court decisions during the Civil War? Now, to begin with, these two acts of defiance are seen as different historically. For you don't need to be a genius to figure out why. I mean, Jackson is defying the Supreme Court on behalf of white settlers in Georgia who want to drive Indians out of their land in a way that's violating a treaty that the United States had entered into. In the Lincoln case, Lincoln's goal is to maintain the safety of the Union and the Capitol, but nonetheless, the principle is what it is, which is this question of presidential defiance. The Jackson action is seen, I think, by basically everyone today, as something that went beyond the bounds of the Constitution. Why could he do it? We know why he could do it, as the question says. He was acting on behalf of the white population, who is a key political element of his constituency. And he's also dealing with a fractured opposition. This is just at the beginning of the formation of the Whig Party, and so there's not a lot of effective opposition to Jackson. Lincoln's issue is quite different, and this point here, which I think is a very astute point, seems to me dangerous to me. The Supreme Court would practically allow the executive branch to ignore their ruling, and it creates a dangerous precedent that the president could override a ruling by the Supreme Court, and then we get 30 years later, and Lincoln does the same. Now, the issue here, any of you who have ever taken a train ride from New York to DC on Amtrak, you've gone through through Baltimore. So this is the route. Stop in Trenton and Philadelphia, Baltimore, and then get to DC. So this is a railway map of the United States in 1860. So just at the onset of the Civil War. And one of the things that you should notice here's Washington, D.C. There are only 2 ways that you can supply Washington, D.C. by rail. One is from the south through Virginia, and the second is through Baltimore. There's no supply routes to Washington, D.C. from the west without going through Baltimore first. And obviously, during the Civil War, you're not going to be supplying D.C. from the Confederate States. So control over Baltimore is critical, and Baltimore was a Confederate sympathizing city in 1861. This is why Lincoln acts. And the argument that he makes is that it's in the national security interest. That's the only reason he says that he's doing this. And ultimately, Congress does approve his action when Congress is called back into session. All that said, a precedent is a precedent, and it will be used later on when we get towards the end of the course during the war on terror during the Bush administration with Guantanamo Bay. The Bush administration will cite Lincoln's action here in 1861 when he ignored Justice Taney's circuit court decision by saying, look, the fact that the Supreme Court didn't crack down on Lincoln after this shows that it accepted a precedent that the president can act outside of judicial norms in instances of national security. Now, the Supreme Court ultimately will say no to Bush on this in a couple of decisions late in his term, but nonetheless, precedents precedents can be used in dangerous ways. So I think most of us, probably all of us, would agree that in this instance, Lincoln acted correctly, because otherwise Washington, D.C. may very well have fallen to the Confederacy in 1861. But good intentions can sometimes still create problematic developments. And then last, to finish up with a kind of lightning round of questions. Was Preston Brooks ever arrested and stripped of his House position for caning Charles Sumner? Yes and yes. He was arrested. He was tried. He was given a token punishment because the Southern jury who was sympathized with him. He was expelled from the House. The seat became vacant. He ran for his old seat in the vacancy, in the special election to fill the vacancy, and was overwhelmingly elected. So his constituents in South Carolina approved of his activity. He ultimately would die very shortly thereafter at age 37 of a respiratory virus, of all things. And so he's out of Congress. Even though he's elected in this special election, he's not in Congress after 1857. So he has this kind of tragic end. Is the Compromise of 1850 seen as favorable towards the Southern slave states and not really a compromise? I think that under the circumstances, it was as close to a compromise as you could get in that system. And and the key difference to me between the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was blatantly in favor of slave expansion. It was a pro-Southern measure. In 1850, the two sides each get something big. So the North gets California as a free state, so that gives them 2 extra votes in the Senate. The South gets the fugitive slave law, which ultimately isn't enforced incredibly aggressively in the 1850s, but nonetheless is very symbolic to them. So again, set aside, for the issue of political analysis, the morality of this measure. It's self-evidently an immoral measure. It is, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Clay is known as the great compromiser for a reason. He has an ability to, to fashion something that both sides can see as a victory. But the key difference here, in 1820, the Missouri Compromise lasted for 30 years. The Compromise of 1850 lasts for only 4. The society is polarizing so quickly that compromise becomes passé. How are Chief Justices selected? What are the qualifications? At this point, Chief Justices really they're coming from politics. So if you look at the first Chief Justice, John Jay, he was later on governor of New York. He was a co-author of the Federalist Papers with Hamilton and Madison. The greatest of Chief Justices, Chief Justice Marshall, was appointed by John Adams just before Adams left the presidency. Marshall had served in Adams's cabinet as his Secretary of State. Imagine like Mike Pompeo being named Chief Justice today. And then when Marshall passes away and is replaced on the court, Andrew Jackson appoints Roger Taney, a close political ally of his, and Taney will serve as Chief Justice until the Civil War. And Lincoln then replaces Taney with Salmon Chase, who was Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury and was a failed Republican presidential candidate. So the pattern at this point in American history, late 18th and 19th through the mid-19th centuries, is to appoint Chief Justices largely for their political connections and their political skills. We live in a different era today. Chief Justice Roberts served in a Justice Department position in the Reagan administration, but he's never been involved with electoral politics in that respect. And if he's replaced down the road, the idea of him being replaced by a senator or a governor or a cabinet official would seem inconceivable. But in the early part of the American Republic, that was not seen as particularly unusual. And then the last of the questions, I got a whole bunch of questions, so I just tried to pick some of the more representative ones. Did Lincoln lose the election for the Senate because of the House divided speech of 1858? And the answer to that question is no. Remember, in the 19th century, senators are chosen not by popular vote in their states, but instead by their state legislature. And in Illinois in 1858, after the election, there are 54 Democrats in the state legislature. There are 46 Republicans or Republican-leaning figures in the state legislature. There's still a few Whigs hanging around. And so the legislature elects Stephen A. Douglas, the Democrat. Nonetheless, Republicans actually get more votes in the General Assembly race than do the Democrats. And this defeat is seen as a victory for Lincoln, partially because of that. Partially because Stephen A. Douglas, although not the most moral man in the world, to put it mildly, was seen correctly as a very talented politician. Illinois was a state that was more democratic than most northern states in the 1850s. So the fact that Lincoln came so close to defeating, the most powerful Democrat outside of the South is, convinces Republicans in 1860 that, yeah, this guy is really a political talent. So the House divided speech, if anything, probably helps Lincoln. One final point on Lincoln in 1858. Illinois is a bitterly racist state. Obviously, all of American society is racist in the 19th century, but there are degrees of racism, and I think it's important to distinguish between them. I mean, blacks have greater rights in New England than they do in the Midwest, and greater rights in the Midwest than they do in the South. But this is a very racist environment. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, any of you who have ever read the transcripts of those, which are published in book form, the amount of racism that spews out of Douglas's mouth is just extraordinary. But he's playing to the crowd, and so Lincoln has to straddle a very tricky line here. He can't be seen as endorsing slavery, because this is really the cardinal principle of Lincoln's belief system: a belief in the Union, and a belief that the Union has the authority to prevent the spread of slavery. But on the other hand, if he is seen as advocating social equality between blacks and whites, that's going to render him unelectable in Illinois, and it would have rendered any Republican unelectable nationally in 1860. So one of the things that Lincoln does in this election is to demonstrate that he can both remain faithful to the more idealistic side of Republican principles on the expansion of slavery without endorsing social equality between blacks and whites, which was, politically impossible at the time. So his rhetoric helps him, and his rhetoric is one of the reasons why the election is as close as it is. So that's what we have for the Q&A for today. Thank you again for the questions, which were excellent, and I'll pick try to get at least a couple of questions answered from each of you over the course of the semester. So the next one will be next week. And other than that, I will see everyone on Monday, and have a good weekend.